Uh, I'll just note I'm going to continue talking about what we've been talking about for, I guess this is the fifth lecture in this series now, which is to say trying to make democracy work better, and I consider it to be a really quite urgent topic as we approach a new election year, and in particular as it looks increasingly like there is a rising tide of populist, anti-immigrant, nativist authoritarianism rising in the democratic world, that we figure out, not only what we can do to address the emergency, but where it's coming from, how to appropriately diagnose the rise of desires to turn democracy in the illiberal direction, to go after minorities, to go after elites, and I'm going to suggest to you, I am suggesting to you that it has a lot to do with the malfunctioning of democracy in the 21st century. And so ultimately, if we want to address this, we need to not just oppose the would-be autocrats, which is obviously important, but also to figure out how we repair our democracy while it's under assault. And so that's the reason for staying with this topic. I will just notice for a moment that, like many of you, I imagine my heart is aching as I watch what is unfolding in Gaza, which has to be one of the largest humanitarian nightmares of the current century, and one that is being deliberately provoked. This is not famine. This is war. It not going to get into an assessment of blame at the moment. I will just say it seems to me that it generates a very clear imperative, which is whatever happens in the next few weeks in Gaza, let us hope it's no longer than that. How do we avoid the need to repeat anything like this in the future? And when I say we, obviously we're not doing this, although our government is arming the Israeli government, which is doing this. The question is, how do we, concerned people of the world, we citizens of one of the most powerful countries in the world, encourage, implore, bring leverage to bear so that the impasse in Israel Palestine is broken and that there is a path forward that does not lead to more mutual barbarizing violence. So just one thing to notice. Second thing, very quickly, and again, topic for perhaps longer discussion in the near future, that the 28th conference of the participants in the UN climate change framework is coming to an end in the UAE in the next few days. There's been some, I think, real progress, for instance, on funding damage and loss. And there are some real battles to be fought still, for instance, on whether or not there will be an agreement to reduce by three times the amount of fossil fuel being used by the world in the next 20-ish years. And so really important stuff unfolding there. I will come back and talk about that as well. But I do want to focus today on this topic and get us further along. We kind of left off midstream last time. So let me see if I can get my slides to cooperate. Okay, there we go. Uh, so today I'm going to transition from the question of fixing old institutions into inventing new ones. So 21st century democratic reform agendas is the big topic, and of course we started this last week. I'm going to return us to the framing ideas. One of them is that we have a choice we have to make, assuming we decide we do want to undertake the project of making democracy work better in the 21st century, is the primary task, is the place we should focus first and concentrate our energies on taking the institutions we already have and repairing them in order to make them work better. And I'm going to focus here primarily on the United States, where we're in a perhaps anomalous position in that our democratic constitution is 225 plus years old. It's a product of the 18th century. It's been updated on a variety of occasions, but I would say that really since the middle of the 20th century, we have not returned to the project of seeing how to make our 18th century old, creaky, musty constitution work better for us in our current political and social conditions. This could be a really important and really promising path of reform if we conclude that it is the most efficacious and the most realistic. Having said that, there's a second approach which we could take, which would be to say, well, in the intervening 220 odd years, we have seen other places in the world experiment with democracy. And some of those places seem to have created different institutions from the ones we have, and we can assess those institutions. Are they doing well? Do they do things better than our institutions do? If so, maybe as opposed to just trying to repair what we innovated a couple centuries ago, we should try to import some lessons from elsewhere in the world, or to begin to experiment anew, to say that 21st century presents problems that perhaps were not there in the 18th century. We are a mass digital media society with a very diverse population, and living in a post-industrial economy, maybe we shouldn't just hope for the idea that we can make our old institutions work better. Maybe those conditions demand new institutions. And by the way, one of the things I'm suggesting, and this will take us into the second theme, is that in the 18th, 19th centuries, when we were engaged in constitutional innovation, ours was a radical mission, right? It was imperfect, obviously, but we really saw ourselves as at the forefront of the modern project of democracy. And perhaps in the 21st century, the democratic aspirations articulated within our Constitution are too imperfectly realized by the Constitution. What was radical in the 18th century is not only conservative, but inadequate in the 21st century. And so maybe as opposed to funneling all our democratic ambitions into occasionally conducted elections, we need institutions that give us greater opportunity for empowered participation in decision making. And then the question, right, of the tension between the promise of democracy and the actual operation of democracy, the idea that the citizens of a democracy are told, you are the ultimate sovereign in your society, and your power, your interests, your needs set the agenda for policy and lawmaking in our society. If that rings hollow, if that appears to be counterfactual or ideological, then the people of a democracy tend to go one of two ways. The first is into anger or discontent at the idea that we're being told we're in charge, but in fact, that doesn't seem to be what's happening in practice. Or the alternative is cynicism and defeatism, and perhaps the idea that we should just give up on this project, right? And so the hope is that we haven't so exhausted our democratic aspirations that they haven't hit their head against the wall of democratic reality one too many times to the point where we just say, okay, we're willing to experiment with someone who is likely is advertising that if we elect him, he will violate central norms of our democratic government, that he will use the power of the government to persecute or go after his political rivals who he now sees as enemies. And I think we have to be honest. This is the way democracies typically die. And we are, it seems, inching closer and closer to that path. And so some of the urgency behind the idea of redirecting our critical energies into democratic reform stems from the idea that if we can't make that agenda realistic for the 21st century, then the life of democracy may be quite limited for societies like ours. And so then this returns us to a final historical idea, which is that democracy is not institutionalized all at once during a revolution or when a constitution is eventually adapted. As opposed to that, it is a gradual process of incremental reform, often punctuated equilibria, right? We stay in one place for a while until the discontents with it build up, until those marginalized or excluded become organized and powerful enough to demand better incorporation, until we recognize that new social developments require new forms of governmental empowerment, and then we reform, right? And slowly but surely, we hope those reforms bring us closer to the aspirations articulated in our revolutions and constitutions, but it requires continuous work. It's been a long time since we have taken up the mantle of democratic reform. I think the last big pushes are in the middle of the 20th century, and we are now inching our way closer to the middle of the 21st century. We can't afford, if we want to maintain democracy, to neglect the project of perfecting democracy, of, in the way that scholars that I'm going to look at in a moment put it, democratizing democracy. And so my suggestion then, as we enter a campaign season and yet another incredibly consequential presidential election, is that we focus not only on defending democracy from the genuine and grave threat it faces from this growing current of populist antagonism, but that we also recognize that in the long term, our ability to meet that threat depends on our capacity to improve, to reform, to democratize democracy in the 21st century. So that's the motive behind this. I've gone through this with you before, a laundry list of problems with democracy in the world today. So many that it's hard to know where to focus. I therefore am simplifying this a little bit and suggesting that we are facing something of a perfect storm with three kinds of, or maybe I guess I should say four kinds of rapid change coinciding, creating high threats, a normative threat, the sense that this economy doesn't work for me anymore, the sense that people like me, who used to be fully incorporated into our society and respected within our institutions, are now increasingly seen to be the oppressors of newly ascending groups, that the technology as well as the demography of our society are creating all kinds of challenges, especially for people who are less well educated, less well incorporated into the economy. A lot of people are saying this is too much and we want it to stop, or we want to go backwards, or we need someone who can sort the good from the bad. We need strong, perhaps authoritative leadership to manage all of these challenges. And then the idea that our unions, our parties, our civil society organizations are not giving us any meaningful sense of agency or empowerment in the 21st century. And therefore, the desire to be able to better control our lives is funneled into populist campaigns that not only have those bottom up organizations declined in membership and efficacy, but also the traditional institutions of electoral democracy seem increasingly captured and unresponsive as so much money has flooded our campaigns, our electoral system, that only the people who can afford to write 6, 7 figure checks seem to be able to really influence the direction of our politics. We add to that that one of our main parties has moved into the authoritarian direction, and seems increasingly um, explicit about its attraction to authoritarian leadership, its desire to use the power of the state to reverse the organic dimensions of cultural and demographic change. That our public sphere is radically transformed by new technology that seems to be undermining the verifiability of the information and diminishing our capacity to share a central reality. And then this idea that we're getting a new kind of nativism, that racial politics are becoming again mainstream. And so whether it's the public sphere, whether it's the responsiveness of our institutions, whether it's the direction of one of our main parties, some of the pillars of democracy are showing signs that they cannot bear the weight of the political demands of the 21st century. That leads us then to the diagnosis. I got it's funny, I keep going back and forth. I now have this slide that only has Daniel Zablat and a somewhat younger Zablat on it. I'm drawing on both Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat, with apologies to Levitsky. I don't have his image on the board, but they're highly influential books. How Democracies Die points out that we have all the hallmarks in the United States today of a path that other democracies have tread, that lead to internal overthrow of the core institutional prerequisites of liberal democracy. That democracies die not through revolution or through invasion, as much as through electing leaders who use the power vested in their office to undermine the very institutional framework on which democracy dies, in order to be able to maintain their power and not have to run the gauntlet of regular elections and the alternation with other parties, right? And then in this year, Levitsky and Zablat offered us a new book, one much more focused on the United States as opposed to comparative politics, and much more focused on what they see as the underlying electoral dynamic. We talked about this last week, the idea that we have a whole bunch of institutions that amplify minority power. And in a situation like the situation we have, let me be as clear as possible about this. Levitsky and Zablat's basic suggestion is that there are two fundamental transformations that the United States is undergoing right now. on the one hand, we are becoming a multiracial democracy, right? The demographics are quite clear. The 2020 census demonstrates that we are well on our way to becoming a society in which there is no racial majority. And what that means, among other things, is that people of European descent, we like to call them white, are no longer as overwhelming numerically, no longer the taken for granted referent of our culture, no longer able essentially to set the agenda for our politics. It is increasingly the case that a multiracial coalition can constitute a majority in American electoral politics. And by the way, the majority of us, the majority of Americans are comfortable, or at least do not find that development to be objectionable. So that's the first transformation. The second transformation, one I guess I'm emphasizing a little bit more than Levitsky and Zablat, they concentrate primarily on race, is that we're becoming a post-traditional society. I was mentioning, right, that I saw the movie Maestro last night, that it's a movie about, among other things, a bisexual man, in which there's a very straightforward presentation of the fact that he is married to a woman, has children with her, is very much in love with her, but that he also enjoys having sex with other men. And so that's the kind of thing that I don't think you would get a mainstream Hollywood movie made about 10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. And here it is, a holiday blockbuster, or at least one that's aspiring to be, that is very open, casual, doesn't really thematize, just goes where the subject matter takes it. And this idea that we increasingly live in a society in which homosexuality is not sanctioned, is not stigmatized, that we live in a society in which there is no longer a supposition that there is one dominant religion, Protestant Christianity, that we live in a society in which not only sexuality but gender norms are becoming much more fluid, much more open, much less traditional and deterministic. Again, Levitsky and Zablat, I believe, and the data I read, I believe, suggests that a majority of Americans are okay with this. But a minority is frightened, panicked, threatened by these developments into a multiracial democracy and a post traditional culture. And our institutions open themselves to a frightened, threatened, highly mobilized minority actually gaining power, a majority of political power within the major institutions of our federal government, and then the possibility of that group using the power they gain to maintain and to maintain power in ways that are anti-democratic, that deny the capacity of the majority to regain power, that deny the outcome of elections when that minority is defeated in the next election. And so again, I won't go into this in detail, but whether we're talking about the Senate or the presidency, two institutions that can result in a majority of power for the group that does not win but loses the popular vote. And then the fact that the president and the Senate together determine the composition of the Supreme Court, the fact that states are allowed to gerrymander, and the fact that our Constitution is so hard to amend, all of this amounts to a opportunity, a almost invitation in certain circumstances for the minority, as opposed to trying to work with the majority, and opposed to trying to convince them, as opposed to changing as necessary to be able to exercise power and influence once the views of the majority have changed, as opposed to, in other words, modernizing. to simply dig in and say we will resist these changes. When a party goes in that direction, this is very threatening, and this is, I know, quite wonky political sciency, but I hope this diagram conveys something important. And so this is two metrics, right? The degree of hostility to liberal democratic principle, norms, and practices, from basically being quite pro-democratic to being quite authoritarian, and degree of hostility to ethnic minority rights, from being very open, inclusive, tolerant, multicultural, to being very hostile and racist. And as you can see, the Democratic Party is kind of in the mainstream of, of parties in democratic societies in the world right now, whereas the Republican Party has become really an extreme right wing party, judging on the kinds of policies it pursues, the themes of its campaigns, the quality or policy positions of the candidates it elects. How does this happen? It happens because although only one Republican has won the popular vote this century, three have been elected because of the way the Electoral College amplifies the power of smaller, whiter, more conservative states. It happens because of the way the Senate amplifies their power as well, the Senate being an institution that is much more conservative than the average American, that has a much higher proportion of representatives of rural areas and a smaller proportion of representatives of urban areas than the actual breakdown of the population of the United States. And then, by the way, those presidents who may be elected by an electoral college despite losing a popular vote, those senators who may represent only 20% of the population but control the majority in the Senate, get to appoint and confirm the members of the Supreme Court to the point where we have a 6-3 supermajority of Republican appointees in the Supreme Court. The federal judiciary as a whole more conservative than Americans, and the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary doing a lot to influence elections in ways that seem to redound to the benefit of the Republican Party, whether that is actually intervening in elections, determining how much money can be spent or how much regulation there can be on expenditures during campaigns, constraining the federal government's capacity to enforce voting rights, constraining the work that the unions can do politically to try to counterbalance the corporations that have had the floodgates open for them. We add to that gerrymandering, which is now less of an issue for the House of Representatives, though it was quite an important issue over most of the last decade, but still a really important issue in terms of the composition of many state legislatures, from Wisconsin to Texas to many other states. And we end up with a Republican Party that is being pulled to the right, that is increasingly divorced from the truth in many of its central claims, that is increasingly opposed to core constitutional issues and increasingly moving into authoritarianism. I will just point out one more time that the majority, not just of Republican elected officials, but of ordinary Republican voters in pollings data, say that the reason Donald Trump is facing 91 felony counts is not because he did anything wrong, but because Joe Biden, the Department of Justice, the prosecutors at the state level are out to get him because he represents what true Americans want and need from presidential leadership. This goes hand in glove with the idea that, by the way, Joe Biden stole the last election. And if Joe Biden stole an election and then used the Department of Justice and the federal judiciary to persecute his main rival, what's good for Biden is also good for Trump. If Trump is reelected, he will try to do the same thing. I think we can be pretty confident of that based on his first 4 years in office, what he's saying on the campaign trail, and what seemed to be on Levitsky and Zablat's account some core personality traits that identify him as an autocratic or authoritarian leader. And so we just have to reckon with the fact that one of our two parties is increasingly taken over, right, by this Make America Great Again movement, by this charismatic leader, Donald Trump, and that the reason this has become viable, at least if you believe the polling data, if you believe the analysis of Levitsky and Zablat, is not because this is where a majority of Americans want us to be, but because our Constitution contains features that encourages this kind of development, even when it is a mobilized minority. And so the idea that we've had a realignment, and that's a fundamental restructuring of the identity and the coalition that supports a political party, that this is now, it seems, accomplished, that our conservative party is now an ethno-racialist, racial, increasingly traditionalist, authoritarian party of grievance, is symptomatic of deep structural problems in our politics. And I'll put this in two forms, right? One of them, the negative, that our institutions open themselves to amplified minority power. The other, the more positive failing, which is that they have produced so much frustration because they do not empower the people in the way they promise to, that the people are increasingly airing their grievances, their sense of indignation at their growing economic vulnerability, at their sense that the society they live in does not care for or does not protect people like them. And so this then gets us to Levitsky and Zablat's proposals. This is where we left off last week. And I'm going to be very brief on the first four. They all have to do with what you might call majority empowerment as a form of democracy promotion. Make it absolutely clear in the Constitution that everyone has a right to vote, and so that doing mischief, trying to suppress voting, is a violation of a constitutional right. Give everyone on the day they turn 18 the right to vote automatically. Don't create bureaucratic impediments to people exercising that right. Do the opposite. Make it as easy as possible, automatic. Similarly, make it easy to actually exercise that right, either through expanding mail-in and early voting. We did a national experiment with this in 2020 because the presidential election coincided with the pandemic. And what we discovered is if you make it easier to vote, more people will vote. If we are pro-democratic, if we want all of our citizens equally included in our political process, make it equally easy for all of them to vote. And this is especially important as long as election day remains a work day, because there are many people who find it hard to get time off work, or who have to get their kids to school, get them home from school, and get them fed and to bed. It makes it really hard for them to vote. So either shift the voting day to not a work day, or make the voting day a national holiday. Or if you can't do all that, at least give people opportunities to vote in ways that don't require them to take time off work to get to the polling place to wait in line on a workday. Restoring voting rights to ex-felons, and I'll just note that in some of our most important states, states like Florida, a substantial portion of African American men are disenfranchised due to former felony convictions. They've served their times, but the impediment to them getting their right to vote back used to be just they were disenfranchised. Now they can have that right restored, but it's a very difficult process. Make it much easier, and we will have more voters. Restore national level voting rights protection, right? We've looked at and talked about in the past, for instance, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The issue here is that in the Shelby v. Holder decision, the Supreme Court took out some of the most important protections put in the 1965 Voting Rights Act and renewed by Congress on numerous occasions. John Roberts' decision in that case said basically that this is anachronistic. We no longer need these protections because the states that used to engage in voting suppression and disenfranchisement have changed. This is not Jim Crow anymore. And we now have more than a decade of experience to make it clear that actually John Roberts was not correct in saying that although we don't have, thank God, the level of violent intimidation and disenfranchisement that we had during the Jim Crow South, many of these states, as soon as the opportunity presents itself, do go back to doing things that skews the value, the opportunity to vote in a highly partisan and also a racially charged way. Replace partisan with nonpartisan electoral administration. Again, the rest of the democratic world looks at us really with a side glance when they see that we allow partisan elected officials, sometimes officials who campaign on the idea that the previous election was stolen, despite the fact that there's no evidence that holds up in a court of law to that effect, that we allow these people to actually run our elections. But more generally, the idea that you don't want, this is a kind of fundamental maxim of law, you want justice not to be done, but to seem to be done. If you have somebody who's elected under the banner of one party administering elections in which both parties are contesting, it creates certainly an appearance of potential bias or mischief. Why not make this a civil service, nonpartisan position administered by lawyers and mathematicians, people who are best suited to detect mischief in the electoral process, address it when it's there, but not themselves do mischief. Now, getting into the second set of recommendations, these are the more ambitious, more structural recommendations. Abolish the electoral college and replace it with a national popular vote. And there are two ways to do this. And I want to be as clear as possible about why I prefer the legislative as opposed to the constitutional amendment path. So one thing to do would be to just alter Article 3 of the Constitution and change the Electoral College into a national popular vote. Would be the most straightforward and direct, would be the most efficacious as well. But having said that, it runs into the problem that the Constitution is extremely hard to amend, and in particular, in a period of heightened partisan polarization, probably impossible to implement major or to get past major substantive constitutional reform. So that takes me to the second way of reforming the Constitution. I'm sorry, of reforming the Electoral College. And that is for states to pass legislation that says no matter who wins that state, the electors of that state will vote for whoever won the national popular vote. And if states representing the majority of electoral college votes pass that legislation, then automatically their electors will vote for whoever won the national election. And then we have bypassed, we've done an end run around the electoral college. And this would be, I think, perhaps one of the most effective reforms for forcing the Republican Party, in terms of its national leadership struggles, to compete for a majority of the popular vote, which would result in a fundamental retooling of its campaign, of its efforts at coalition building. Reform the Senate so as to make it more proportional. And if constitutional amendment is hard in general, this one is all but impossible in the absence of genuine and powerful leverage to force smaller states to relinquish their disproportionate power in the Senate. And we've talked about this before. The ratio of the smallest state to the biggest state at the time of the founding might have been about 10 to 1. It's now about 60 to 1. So the level of disproportion has been amplified. And at the same time, the states have become peculiar containers, right? That there are some states that are wider, older, more conservative, some states that are younger, more diverse, and more progressive. That doesn't have to be the case, but it is the case. And so it's not just amplifying the power of a state, it's amplifying the power of a particular slice of our population, racially, ideologically, demographically, and that seems to contort our politics. Having said that, the idea that we could reform this via a straightforward constitutional amendment process is a non-starter, because the Constitution protects this in a way that it protects nothing else. You need unanimity. Any state can veto removing the equal representation of all states. And I think the likelihood that Wyoming, North Dakota, Vermont, Delaware is going to relinquish its incredible advantage in the way in which it's represented in the Senate, it's a non-starter. So how do we do this? I think the only prospect for success here would be generating great leverage. And so the ideas mentioned: give Washington, D.C., or threaten to give Washington, D.C. statehood, probably in terms of democratic justice. I shouldn't say probably, certainly in terms of democratic justice, they should have statehood. Threaten to give Guam, threaten to give Puerto Rico statehood, threaten perhaps to subdivide California into 6 or 8 states. They wouldn't be the smallest states in the Union. And all of a sudden, you would have a major shift in the balance of power in the Senate. Maybe some of the smaller conservative states would prefer to give one more representative, not only to California, but to Texas and Florida, and Pennsylvania and New York, and we could keep going and try to figure out where the threshold is, where you get extra representation in the Senate, thinking that they could better preserve their advantage via a little bit more representation for the less populous, I'm sorry, for the more populous states, than by facing this onslaught of new states. I think this is all quite far fetched at this moment. On the other hand, the idea of DC statehood, of Puerto Rican statehood, I think are required by democratic justice, and very important ideas as perhaps an independent reform. Maybe use that as a little bit of leverage to try to get the Senate reformed. Replace single member, winner take all, with multi-member proportional districts. And this might be among the most technical and difficult to understand and explain aspects of Levitsky and Zablat's reform agenda. I'm going to do my best to unpack it and to pair it with number 12 as well, expand the House, right? These two, by the way, eliminating gerrymandering goes hand in hand with this as well. These are all ways of trying to reform the mode of representation in the House of Representatives to make the House more representative, more accountable, less polarized. And again, I want to be as clear as possible. The suggestion of Levitsky and Zablat is that we have a Republican Party, a conservative party that is an outlier, that has moved much farther to the extreme right because of institutional features, because of the way in which our Constitution encourages that development. Relatedly, they would also suggest that the degree of polarization that we experience in our politics right now, in which each side views the other side as a threat to democracy, in which we fail to manifest our duty of civility in our relationship to the partisan other, in which we are not listening to their arguments, their claims, their concerns, in which we dismiss them out of hand, given their partisan identity and our low opinion of the party they come from and the way in which that party generates disinformation and deeply ideological perspectives, opinions, views that we can dismiss out of hand. That's a major failure of democracy. And it's produced by the way we structure our elections. So let's restructure our elections. Again, this can be done through ordinary legislation. This does not require a constitutional amendment. It does require getting down into the wonky tall grass and explaining to people that the way in which we structure our elections is not the only way to structure them, that there are alternatives that are actually preferred in most of the democratic world. You, as opposed to having one representative in your district, you have a larger district with multiple representatives. And in each election, you get to vote for multiple people. That the result of voting for multiple people is, on the one hand, that you can eliminate partisan primaries, right? That the election itself serves as the primary because everyone who wants to run can be included in the election. You don't need to whittle it down to two people. That makes it much more likely that politicians will campaign for the median voter, for the middle of the ideological perspective, as opposed to campaigning for the most extreme, the voter who only turns up in the primary campaign. It also makes it much more likely that we can break the stranglehold of the two-party system and have third-party candidates in the House of Representatives. And the result of that will be greater debate, greater deliberation, greater compromise. If we combine this with expanding the House, and I'm just going to show you, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I was, but I don't think I have those slides right now. The expansion of the House by, let us say, 150 members. The first time we would have expanded it in over a century, the result would be many more competitive elections and a move to the middle, a depolarization of our politics. This is stuff, if we don't like the way our democracy is working, we can fix with ordinary legislation. Similarly, you can abolish the filibuster, the rule that essentially lets 20% of the population's representatives block legislation favored by 80% of the country's representatives. Get rid of that rule. It has risks, right? It has the risk that when the other side is in power, they'll get to do what they want to do without the capacity of the minority blocking it. But it seems to me it's worth the risk in the current moment. We need responsive legislation coming out of our Congress to make the idea of democracy credible. Supreme Court term limits, right? And this is, I think, relatively straightforward, but I think we're increasingly seeing, right, the average term of a Supreme Court justice is double what it was in the first half of the 19th century. People being appointed younger, living longer, serving longer. And the result is that there's less generational turnover, that the people who are graduating from college today may have to wait half their lives before somebody their age, before somebody attuned to their experiences and concerns ends up on the court. And then there may be another multiple generation wait if we keep going down this path. This will require a constitutional amendment. And that gets us to the final proposal. And I want to say, in a sense, the single most important proposal, if we're going to reform the Constitution, is to make it easier to reform the Constitution. Let this be done simply by the House and the Senate via supermajority, 60%, but don't make three-quarters of the state approve constitutional amendments. And again, the reason we have in the 21st century so much of an 18th century constitution preserved, and the reason we're trying so hard to make our old Studebaker perform like a Tesla, to make our ancient constitution perform for the concerns of 21st century democracy, is because it's so hard to update these institutions, because they were built with a bottleneck to prevent reform from occurring. Now, having said all of this, I promised at the beginning, I want to conclude at the end by saying we need to assess these proposals in two regards. The first of them concerns how well they would work to repair our democracy. And to be as clear as possible, none of this moves us beyond electoral democracy, right? We're still channeling all of our political energy into occasionally conducted elections. And the limitations with that form of democracy, with the fact that we get indirect but not direct influence. The best we can do is hope to influence who represents us. And the fact that we don't get to participate when elections are not occurring, that our politics comes in punctuated spasms of attention, followed by returning back to the role of passive spectator. Those may not be adequate to 21st century demands for empowered inclusion in democratic decision making. So that's one limitation. All we do, and it's going to be very hard, is repair the old kind of democracy if we only follow those recommendations. Here's the second limitation. These are really, really hard things to do. How, and I'm going to return to a question that John asked last week, how likely is it that people are going to get sufficiently excited to be mobilized to bring these reforms about, if there's little likelihood that there's going to be much electoral payoff to campaigning on these issues, that if you start going down this path, people are going to start snoring and their eyes are going to roll back in their heads, then this is a really hard path to see succeeding, even if it would, if it did succeed, make democracy work much better in the 21st century. And so I'm going to conclude by suggesting there are two serious strikes against this approach. One, that it really doesn't get us to 21st century democracy, and two, that it's really hard to see it succeeding given the constitutional impediments and given the technical and unexciting nature of the reforms. And that's going to lead me then next week to start talking about, well, maybe we need to think more radically about democratic reform in the 21st century. I'll stop there. Want to hear your comments, your questions, your ideas. Obviously, making a somewhat ambitious argument with you today. What do you think? Who wants to start us out? Are you going to prove my point that this is too wonkish to get anybody excited about?
No, no.
Barbara, are you raising your hand?
I am, yes. I think this is a terrific list, and I agree it would be very difficult to bring about, but it makes sense to me to straighten out the inequities that have evolved as our population has grown and settled in various parts of the country, so that we have this very unbalanced Senate population, Senate representation.
And electoral college.
And electoral college, yeah.
Good.
Definitely be a college, yes.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and mute you, Barbara.
I'm gonna go ahead and mute
when I leave you on, we get this echo. But thank you for the good comment and for the endorsement of Levitsky and Zablat's ideas. They're not mine, right? But I do think they're good ideas. And by the way, it's not just I could go through 5 other books. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask how I can learn more about the proportional representation. Which of the books would you recommend reading? Because I don't think I fully comprehend it. And I'm trying to do the thought experiment where we think about how California would change versus how South Dakota would change. You know, but I just need to know more about it because I don't think I fully comprehend how it actually works.
So I'll tell you what, let me start the conversation next week with some more information on this. Let me show you, for instance, one of the books I'm looking at. As I said, there are many lists. This recently published book by John Davenport called The Democracy Amendments. Has some really good concrete illustrations of how proportional representation changes the overall dynamics of the electoral process. And then I'll try to look at more concretely what it would look like, for instance, for Texas. Right now, Texas's delegation to Congress is 2-to-1 Republican to Democrat, right? And note that the division of the vote in Texas is basically 55-45, right? So there's a vast amplification. It's not all about gerrymandering. It is somewhat about gerrymandering, but it's also about the fact that Democrats, in a sense, self-gerrymander. They pack themselves into urban areas. And that means that their overall proportion of the vote isn't translated into representation, because if one representative gets 80% of the vote in their district and another wins by 51%, well, when they get to Congress, they each have 1 vote. But the first person has actually is representing the votes of many more people. Shifting to multi-member districts, which is one way to do proportional representation, allows that 80% in the one district to influence the outcome of many more elections. And so in Texas, this would still mean that the majority of representatives would be Republican, but it would be a proportionate majority, 60% as opposed to 75% of the representatives, or 2/3 of the representatives as it is now. Does that make
So for
sense?
example, yeah, that makes sense. But for example, in California, I'm assuming that rather than having 40 some or 50 some, however many different representation House of districts we might have 15 or 20. And then within those 15 or 20, it would be possible for multiple parties to send reps to Congress. Is that right?
Um, so when you say 15 or 20, you mean
I don't know. Yeah,
districts?
districts, yes.
Yeah, so exactly. And I'm seeing right now if I can get a diagram for you. Let me look real quick. I'm not exactly sure where it is on a variety of slides that I might have available to me. But let me also just try to describe this in simple terms. And the idea would be, for instance, that you would have a district that incorporated much of the San Francisco Bay Area, and then a district that incorporated much of the San Diego area, and a district that incorporated much of the Los Angeles area, and a district that incorporated much of the Central Valley, for instance. I did find my slide. Let me see if I can show you with Texas for a moment. Um, uh, trying to do two things at once here, but so yes, there would be, as opposed to there are right now, right, 50 odd single member districts, maybe 8 multi-member districts, and each of those multi-member districts would have, right, a geographic basis, and then within them, each person would have proportionate power, right? So this is an illustration of what this looks like, for instance, in Texas. And as you can see right now in Texas, you've got, right, all of these single member districts, and there's a strong skew in the direction of Republican representation. If instead of that, right, most of the population in Texas is in this area, you created multiple 4 to 5 person districts, right? It would shift the partisan balance to be closer to the balance in the state of overall popular vote. And it would also, and David, I just want to emphasize this, I'll come out of the slides now, make it such that the median voter, the average voter, would have a more decisive impact in elections. Right now, essentially, the majority of our single member districts are safe districts, right? And so the vote that really matters is the primary vote. Only about 20% of the electorate turns up for primaries. They tend to be the most ideologically extreme or pure voters. And so by the time we get to the general election, we've got a contest between ideologically extreme candidates. This alternative would remove that dynamic. And I really strongly believe that extreme partisan polarization is anti-democratic because it prevents us from listening to the other side. All I need to know is that you're a MAGA Republican. Thank you very much. I'm done with you, right? And that's not democracy, right? That's become just a sheer contest for power in which, yes, we have equal votes, but we're no longer listening to each other, no longer trying to persuade each other, no longer respecting each other as political equals. I have disqualified you from political respect based on your partisan identity before a word comes out of your mouth. That's not really democracy. And that is what our political system is producing. We need a political system that doesn't produce that. In the 18th century, we formed our political opinions by reading newspapers, by congregating in town hall meetings. We didn't have mass media. We didn't have social media. In light of the dynamics of this new media system, we don't need to amplify the way in which we are siloed, the way in which we're enclosed in hermetically sealed information environments. We need to counteract that. And so
Dave-
this is a
David?
reform that would counteract that.
David, can you hear me?
I can. Who is this?
This is Iris Winogrand.
Hi,
I'm
Iris.
sorry, I can't get the video to operate, but I
That's
would
okay.
like to add another thought to the complexities. And it was highlighted in the most recent Public Citizen news.
Hmm.
And it has to do with the power of corporations. The power of corporations to control the agenda in the Senate and the House.
Yeah. And so thank you for that, Iris. And it's funny. I'm not going to go back into my slides. I've already got a different set of slides now to show the Texas example. But the next set of considerations I was going to look at, the next set of reform proposals, come from a different place, right? So part of what I'm trying to convey to you is that how you diagnose the ills of democracy very much influences how you propose to treat them, right? And so Levitsky and Zablat concentrate on the fact that we have a minority of Americans who seems to be moving in a more populist authoritarian direction in reaction against racial and cultural change occurring in our society. I was going to start us by looking also at people who have another diagnosis. The problem is money. The problem is lobbying. The problem is the way in which our campaigns are financed and the outsized influence in shaping the political agenda of the hyper wealthy. And so I absolutely am interested in that theme. And I just want to note, right? We do need to figure out which of these problems is most pressing in order to determine which of the reforms we should pursue first. But yes, Iris, I'll look for that. Thank you. I haven't seen it yet, but clearly this is something that's on many people's minds, and whether it's through financing campaigns or through sponsoring retreats or through employing lobbyists, electoral politics in the United States has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And note that most of us don't have multiples of billions of dollars to spend on politics. So this is part of what's generating the, I think, valid impression that our politicians are bought and sold and that we don't really get much influence over them at all. Bob, you've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead.
My question is just a practical one. Can an individual state implement this multi-representative districts just by, within the state, without anybody else worrying about it? And in particular, then, given California's position as the leader of the world, should we lobby hard to get it done here in California?
Yes, so there's currently some federal legislation that makes it difficult or impossible to do this. So there does need to be a change in aspects of the federal electoral regulation law. And by the way, please note that many states had this system of representation in the 19th century. This is not something that's un-American or that would be completely novel or revolutionary. It's actually returning to a system that had been used in states before. So the reason this legislation was passed was to stop the states from doing this. By the way, it was a progressive reform. I think it's a misguided progressive reform, but it was part of the progressive movement to try to have a uniform election system so that people could move from state to state and not be confused about the nature of the election system as they entered a new place. But having said that, yes, it would require some federal reform to make it as easy as possible to do. Some states like Maine are already pursuing aspects of this. And as you may be aware, right, some of the municipal elections, like in San Francisco, are structured this way as well. So we have some greater experience with this. We could continue to reform along these lines. To fully and successfully do it, we need federal legislation, not just state regulation. Thanks, Bob. Good question. Anyone else for today? All right, everyone. Be well. Have good weeks. Happy Hanukkah to all of you who are celebrating it. I look forward to being back with you next week. Please take care and see you soon. Bye, guys.